most mold in a house is hidden. Think of mold like an iceberg, right? So if you think of the Titanic and the iceberg, it wasn't the tip of the iceberg that sunk the Titanic. It saw it and it steered around the tip that was outside of the water. It hit the gigantic glacier that was down below, and that's what took it down. And that's really what happens in homes. It's, if you're seeing it, it's like way worse than it is on the other side, right? Like it's coming out. Most times it's not surface growth. Most times there are leaks or damage issues or building envelope problems that's allowing moisture to come in. And that all happens kind of like behind the scenes of your walls and stuff. And so you don't really see it.
Welcome to the Soaring Child podcast, where parents of children with ADHD learn tips and tricks to help their child soar at home, at school, and in life. We feature interviews with experts, medical professionals, and parents just like you who are learning how to reduce ADHD symptoms using food and other natural strategies. Because children with ADHD deserve to soar just like every other child. I'm Dana Kay, your host. Hello parents, this is Dana Kay here with another edition of the Soaring Child podcast. Now, recently I had the pleasure of sitting down with one of my team members, Wendy. Now, she bravely shared her personal journey through the trials of home mold exposure. And her story was this powerful reminder of how something as invisible as mold can have a profound impact on our health, especially for our kids with ADHD. So if you haven't listened to that episode yet, I'm definitely going to put the link to that in the show notes today down below. Now, today we're actually going to dive deeper into this issue. We are going to focus on a crucial aspect that often gets overlooked in this whole mold thing, and that's choosing the right home mold test. You know, not all tests are created equal, and making the wrong choice can really leave dangerous mold undetected that can continue to affect your family's health. I've seen it time and time again with the families that I've worked with. So to guide us through this complex but vital topic, I'm thrilled to welcome Brian Karr to the show. Brian is actually a second-generation indoor environmental consultant and the co-founder of We Inspect and the Dust Test. You know, he specializes in helping hypersensitive individuals, many of whom have complex medical conditions. Brian has made a name for himself as an authority on mold and biotoxin issues, and his work has helped thousands of people create healthier living environments. And his dedication to educating both consumers and health practitioners is truly inspiring. And that's exactly how I met him, at a health conference. So Brian, thank you for joining us today. I want to just dive in. I'm so excited that you're here, and I really, really appreciate you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I don't know, I'm feeling a little emotional today. I started to tear up for some reason during that intro. I don't know. I'm having all the feelings today, but it just rings true because that's really what I try to do, and just nice to hear it. I guess
that's so wonderful to hear. I totally get it. That's why I do what I do, and I have to say, mold is such an emotional topic, so I can totally understand that tear coming up in your eye. I've seen countless families that have gone through it. And I can tell you right now, in my business, there are actually 3 of my team members that are going through mold right now, and the emotional journey that comes with it. And I know there's a lot of people out there that might assume that if they can't see or smell the mold, their home is safe. Can you just explain why this assumption can be really dangerous?
Yeah, it's literally one of the biggest myths in our industry that creates this false belief of how things work. And it then makes people get more sick because it's not connecting the dots. You have this thing a lot of us, just normal human nature. If I don't see, out of sight, out of mind, that concept, out of sight, out of mind, right? And so you're like, oh, I don't see anything, so it's gotta be fine, And then a lot of times that couples with not everyone in the house is actually feeling something.
Yes.
So then you've got there's this invisible thing that no one sees, and only one person in my house is feeling it. It can't be my house because I'm fine and there's nothing anywhere. And then that's how this whole thing spirals in someone's head when they're trying to rationalize it. So Just the quick on this to try to set that straight as well as I can in a short time period is most mold in a house is hidden. Think of mold like an iceberg, right? So if you think of the Titanic and the iceberg, it wasn't the tip of the iceberg that sunk the Titanic. It saw it and it steered around the tip that was outside of the water. It hit the gigantic glacier that was down below, and that's what took it down. And that's really what happens in homes. If you're seeing it, it's like way worse than it is on the other side, right? Like it's coming out. Most times it's not surface growth. Most times there are leaks or damage issues or building envelope problems that's allowing moisture to come in. And that all happens kind of like behind the scenes of your walls and stuff. And so you don't really see it. But our home, the air that moves through our home does not stop at walls. And, we look at a wall and it looks solid, knock on the wall, right? It looks solid, like nothing can come through here. But this wall is basically made of paper. Yeah. And then there's also joints and cracks where all of our walls connect to different areas of our house. And so there's all these penetration points that, again, we don't see because when you buy a house, you got baseboards that cover them up. And you got your light fixture sockets that cover up the weird cutout in your wall. And you got all these things. And there's so many paths for stuff to come through. And so anytime you turn on like your air conditioning system or you turn on your exhaust fan in a bathroom, or you even open a window in your house, you're changing the airflow and the air pressure in the house. And what that does is it pulls air throughout the house. And so if you have issues behind a wall or in a ceiling or in a cabinet, you're effectively like sucking that out whenever the air pressure changes in your house. You can't see it because it's particles that are too small for the human eye to see, but it gets into our breathing zone and that's how we get exposed. And so that's why it's so important not to rely on visible or smell. Touch on the smell thing real quick because that was the visible thing. The smell thing, that is called a VOC. It's a microbial volatile organic compound. It's essentially a gas offput that happens from mold when it is actively feeding and breaking down its food. It is Dr. Jill Krista, who's an authority on the health side of this. I'm friends with her, and she always calls it mold farts. That's what she calls it. But it's eating and it lets gas off, right? Yeah. That only happens if the mold actively has a moisture source and is actively eating and breaking down its material. But most things in a home, most mold problems in a home are from water issues that happened in the past that are no longer wet. And so if you take the moisture away, it can't eat anymore because it's not active. If you take that away, it's not letting the gas off anymore. So if you only rely on the smell, you're like 90% missing the problem if that's what you're relying on, right? So if you just like rely on your core senses of sight and smell, you're missing almost all of it. And so that's the big challenge.
Well, it just reminds me actually, because I'm really sensitive to the mold smell. As soon as I walk into somewhere that has that smell, I can feel it straight away in my face. I don't know if I've just got this extra sense or something, but I remember going to a hotel in Puerto Rico that had been taken out by like a tsunami or a cyclone or something, and they'd redone it and everything. But as soon as I walked into that hotel room, straight away it hit me. But that's really uncommon to actually smell it. I'm so glad that you've broken that down, and I think it's in such an easily digestible way, and it makes total sense. So, I mean, I've got all these thoughts that are swimming around in my mind, but I think probably what most listeners are wanting to know, well, like if you can't smell it and you can't see it, what are the signs of water damage or signs of like that home mold growth?
Well, you actually kind of said it. It's water damage, right? And so that doesn't look like mold, right? But that's the thing that our eye can see. So when you think of what mold needs to grow, it needs a food source, which our entire house is basically made out of. It needs the right temperature, which is the temperature we're comfortable at living at. So there's nothing we can really do there. The third piece of the formula is water, right? So it's like watering a plant, basically. Like that's what it needs. You could have a plant seed and you can have the soil and you could have everything set there. And if you don't water it, the plant's not going to grow. And so that's how mold works, right? And so when it's like, well, how do you guys find this stuff that's hidden that nobody can see? It's because we're actually not looking for mold. It's the big secret. We don't actually look for mold in the house. I mean, we'll see it, obviously, and we'll say, hey, we saw something, but we don't go in looking for mold. We go in looking for really subtle signs of previous water damage. And that's the big difference. And it's so funny because most people in their home don't even know that these things were there, right? Like there's a little baseboard somewhere with a little bit of bubbling in the paint at the bottom of the baseboard. Nobody looks at their house like that. And I don't blame you. Like, why would you? Right? Like, my eyes look at a house like I'm walking into the Matrix and I see code everywhere. Right? But like, that's not how normal people are. And so it's really surprising for people when we go in, we're like, hey, we found 10 things, 15 things, 20 things, 7 things, whatever it is. And then we start showing them, see this little bubbling paint here, see this little warping in this little floorboard over here. This area under sink, it has just like a little like crack right here, and it's right, like all these little things. And we know that water is the precursor to mold. So our strategy and how we go about the inspection piece of this is, first you identify anywhere where something looks like it could have been water damage. I'm not saying every crack in your house is water damage, right? But there could be water damage that caused specific types of cracking or peeling or buckling or things like that. And then the next step from a testing perspective is, what we want to do is lay the framework. Here's everywhere I think there could be something based off the visual, and also a conversation with the client about, hey, has there been leaks in your house before? Trying to get like a history like you would have with like a doctor and a medical onboarding, and kind of put all that together. And then the plan is, okay, I want to come in and we need to test each of these areas specifically where the damage is, to find if mold is hiding behind that place. So take a wall, for example. Let's say there's bubbling on a baseboard at the bottom of a wall. What we would want to do is actually test inside that wall, right above where that bubbling was, right where, as close to the water visual that we see. And is there mold growing right here? And that's how we go.
I've got like all of this stuff going off in my mind going, okay, does that mean that you need to like knock a hole in my wall?
Well, so if you do wall cavity testing like that, it's a hole that's like the size of like a pencil, basically, that you put in a wall. And then you basically draw air out of that hole into an air sample pump. So you use an air test, but you put it directly right to an area as close to a suspected source as you can. And that's kind of like the superpower of air samples, right? Is if you can do it in a very strategic spot as close to a problem that's hidden, that's where it shows you a lot of value in an air test, as opposed to what most of the industry does, which is, I'm going to put an air sample pump in the middle of a bedroom and I'm just going to take air. And the problem with that is, the further away you get from a source, the less and less and less accurate that test gets. And we actually ran an internal study on this a few years ago, where like if I went into a house and I thought there was mold, mold in a wall, I would test the wall the way I just described, but then I would take like 3 steps away and I would just put an air sample at like breathing level, at air quality level. And 78% of the time there was a problem in the wall. 3 feet away, the air sample said there was no problem at all. And so it just went to prove like that is not the right type of test to say I have a mold problem or not. And so that's
fascinating. And I think that sort of like leads us to like, not all tests are created equal, but we'll definitely get to that soon. Oh my gosh, I've just got so much bubbling up in my head right now. Maybe I need to do 2 episodes on this, but I just want to, or I'm using it for my own personal mold investigation in my house. Now, I know obviously you can point it out by those little bubbles, and that's great. One thing I want to ask is, and this has happened to me quite a lot of times, I've got boys. Boys are messy. Boys spill water on the carpet. Water, dries, and you just don't know. What about under the carpet? Like if my kid spills like a big cup of water on the carpet and then it dries, is there going to be mold that's growing under there?
It's a really good question. And let me answer it. And then the other area that kids really screw up, I'll talk about that too. So mold needs at minimum 24 hours of moisture to grow. So if you get something dried out before 24 hours, then there's not enough time for the mold types that can grow that quickly. It's not enough time for them to grow. So if you spilled a little bit of water or something, right? And you get down there and you're like, pushing your paper towels and your towels and you're soaking up everything that you can. You're doing really, really good about that. The likelihood that there's going to be like a significant mold issue under there, because when 24 hours passed and if you pulled up most of the moisture and there's just a little bit left, the likelihood of a significant problem isn't very high.
But I can tell you with my boys, they're not telling me that there's water that's been spilled over their bedroom floor, nor do I realize that it's in there until it's dry.
Yeah. Well, I mean, carpet is interesting. I actually just the last episode on my pod was from somebody asking about carpet. So I literally just like have this all fresh in my head. So like there's two things with carpet. One is what you just described. Does it become a source? Listen, if your kids dump a whole bunch of water in there and it stays there and it doesn't dry out, then it can be for sure, right? And that's why it's really important to like instill in our kids, I have to tell you the story after, to instill in our kids that we can't be doing that, right? The other thing about carpet though, especially for people that are sensitive, and we work with a lot of kids, ADHD, pandas. I had a girl that we worked with where she went and got a neuroquant, and the person who ran the neuroquant said that it was the worst one she's ever seen. And it looked like there was volcanoes just exploding in her brain in the neuroquant. Like, it's crazy, right? So when you're that sensitive, it's not just like, is there a source somewhere, but it's also like what their kind of constant exposure is. And the other thing that carpeting does, it retains dirt and dust and particle, and it sits in there and it doesn't go anywhere. And then as you take steps and footsteps on that, you're popping that back up into the breathing zone. And it essentially, like, carpet creates more dust, more particle in your house because it's a collection net for all of it, as opposed to a solid floor where you can clean, you can vacuum, it's not soaking onto that stuff. So the carpeting piece, especially for kids with ADHD or any sort of hypersensitivity, if you have the ability to not have carpet in your house, no brainer, don't have carpet in the house, because you're going to reduce a lot of the just consistent exposure they get that you have no control over because of the carpet. So you brought that up. I wanted to share that.
That's a total gold nugget there. I think that's a really, really good thing to know. You talked about this neuroinflammation, and I referenced previously the episode I did with Wendy, who's part of my team. She shared her personal story on our podcast, and she described severe health impacts her family experienced due to mold exposure in their house. And for those who might be experiencing sort of some of these unexplained health issues, and listeners that are curious, what are some of those signs or symptoms that you see where it may sort of alert them that they should consider mold testing?
Yeah, I'll give you general, and then I'll give you some kid specific ones too. General symptom sets that are multi-system, multi-symptom in your body. So what I mean by that, your body has different systems. You have your neurological system, your digestive system, your reproductive system, your nervous system. You have all these different systems in your body. So if you're having multiple symptoms, right, different health effects that are occurring across different systems in your body, all like either at the same time or back and forth or whatever, that is a huge, huge red flag, at least from my experience. Full disclosure, I'm not a doctor, right? I just talk to a lot of them. That is a huge red flag that there is some sort of exposure going on that's triggering you. And what's happening is that it's an inflammatory problem, and inflammation is not like just specific to one area of your body. And then all of a sudden, all of the systems in your body start freaking out as if you're setting them on fire. And then you start getting the symptoms, right? So a symptom cluster that's across different systems in your body is a really, really big thing. Also, if you've been going down the road of treatments on something specific and you've been talking to multiple doctors and they put you on the pills and they've done this and they've done that and none of it's working, that means they haven't found the root of what's causing the problem. And in those cases, a lot of the times it comes back to environment. And that's just something to check. It doesn't mean that that's always the answer, but like, if you feel like you've kind of gone through it and you've done everything and your doctor's like, I don't know, then you're like, okay, I need to kind of get outside of the normal societal approach of go to the doctor, get a pill for my symptom, and actually try to figure out like what's causing it. And a lot of times environment is a big piece.
Yeah,
so I think those are two really big
choir things here, Brian. And all of our listeners know that I'm always about getting to the root cause and really like investigating, because it may not be what you see right away. And okay, I completely interrupted you there.
Yeah, no. Just to wrap it up, because I know it shows that it focuses on kids. Just a couple kid things.
Yeah.
Sudden change in personality. Like when I've heard people talk about that, it always ties back to some sort of neurological thing, and then we always find problems, right? Like there's always something there. The other one was late onset bedwetting. So like if your kid has been potty trained and then all of a sudden they start peeing the bed again, that's been another thing that anytime that has happened, it's been like pretty significant issues that we've seen in the house. And that one actually got brought up to me by Dr. Jess Petros. And I was talking to her about it. She's like, oh yeah, this is super common. And then that that's a problem. It was somebody that she referred to us a long time ago. I was like, oh, well, there you go.
Well, interestingly, my son used to, wet the bed and until we moved into our new house, as soon as we moved into a new house, like literally overnight, stopped happening. So funny that you bring it up. Look, I see a lot of neurological issues with kids that also have colonization of mold going on in their body. And so like this is a big topic for our kids that have ADHD, that have anxiety. And, yes, there might be a sudden onset, but if you've been living in that mold and it's been slowly growing and growing, you may not get that sudden onset. But neurological issues, I think even not just for kids, but for adults as well, like that brain fog. Like, why don't you list out like some of those like top 3 symptoms? And I know that they can be so different for so many people, but there are some real hallmark symptoms of mold exposure.
Yeah, I mean, I would say neuro brain fog is probably one of the really big ones that come up. And, it's interesting when you think about it, like mycotoxins are fat soluble. Your brain is 60% fat. So if you've got this point where you're getting this stuff moving through your system, then it wants to go there because that's like where the most fat is in your body, right? And so then it actually, that's why I think, again, not a doctor, but that's why I think that the brain fog, forgetfulness, just all that stuff happens for so many people.
Yeah.
Gut issues is another huge one. The gut is really, I had, on my pod, I talked about the gut a few times and I was speaking with someone and they were kind of explaining like why the gut gets impacted so much. So the gut gets impacted by not only what you eat, but also what you breathe. So the gut is getting it from 2 places. So, if you happen to eat, heavy toxin, mold toxin food, obviously, and you're sensitive and that builds up, like that's something, but the majority of exposure is actually from the breath pathway and not from the food that you eat from the mycotoxin perspective. And when you breathe,
want to stop you there. Sorry. You've mentioned the word mycotoxin a few times, and I know that I'd have a lot of listeners that will go, well, what's mycotoxin? So can you just touch on that quickly?
Yeah, so anyone who's heard the phrase toxic mold, so what the reference there is, they're actually referring to this toxin that mold creates. So certain molds have the ability to create a neurotoxin as a defense mechanism to protect itself and its territory. So think of it like a volcano kind of. So with roots and it like has its area, right? And so you have your mold and it's growing here over here. And if another mold or bacteria, or if it's colonized in your body and your immune system or literally anything comes to threaten it, if it has the ability to produce that toxin, it will create that toxin over the top of it, similar to like how lava would fall out of a volcano, basically. And so that toxin is an equal opportunity, like it doesn't care, right? There are certain people, so mold at its core is an allergen, just mold spores, mold fragments. Toxins are a chemical. So you have like a living particle, which mold is a living thing, and then you have toxin that is a chemical thing. They're 2 completely different things, but they're related from how the toxin's created. So some people are so sensitive, whether it's their genetic makeup or other things are going on, that just the particle, even if the toxin isn't there, is going to trigger enough of an inflammatory response in the body. Because again, at a core, all mold is allergen. So there will be an inflammatory response, right? So if your body can't handle it for whatever reason, that's enough. You don't always have to have the toxin. But for other people, if the toxin gets in there, the toxin actually gets into your cells. It starts mitochondrial dysfunction. When your mitochondria stop working, that's like your body's energy source. So think of like you're now draining your battery and now your body can't fight as hard, but then it also goes to these fatty areas and it starts creating inflammation in your tissue essentially. And that's why you start getting multi-system symptom stuff like we're talking about. So that's the difference between the 2. So thanks for having me clarify. It's important. It's not always the thing that's causing it. But if it's there, it's important. So anyways, neurological, gut, very heavily impacted. I would say like the third thing is more of a, I don't like limit to three, but like a general inflammatory like pain response of some kind in the body. Sometimes it's like, oh, I have fibromyalgia, or I have chronic fill in the blank pain syndrome where the doctors don't know what it is, right? Any of that stuff. And then I would say maybe the last thing is like skin. Skin's another really big thing, because whatever your body can't get rid of, it now starts coming out of your skin. So like that was actually my thing when I first had my exposure. I actually had like eczema on my face, and that was like my entryway into this world a decade ago before I got started.
Yeah, we've all got that personal story. When you get into this different world, it's like, you know, there's that motivation, there's something driving that. So thank you for sharing that. I want to quickly touch on, you know, you mentioned a few times about, well, it might not affect everyone in the house. Okay. And I'm sure listeners are curious in your experience. Well, is everyone impacted by mold? Why do some people show these symptoms and some don't?
Yeah. So it's kind of a layered question. The first thing is, you know, every person is different, right? So you have, there's kind of like three reasons someone's going to react to something. One is your genetic makeup. Some people are just predisposed to not be able to detox. There's about 24% of us that just can't do it, right? So I
want to stop you again there, and I'm sorry for just interrupting you and going on little tangents here. And I want to just add to that. So I do a lot of genetic testing in our business. We're looking at, you know, detox pathways for kids, methylation pathways for kids, and it's so fascinating. Parents think, okay, well, if I've got detox issues, my kids definitely have detox issues as well. So why aren't they responding? But I've done families of 5 people and looked at all their genetics. You've got some families that look on the genetic report like they've come from each other. And then you've got other families where every kid is so different. Parents are so different to the children because there's so many different options for what can happen in that pathway. So I just wanted to add that, like, yes, it could be genetic, but genetic doesn't mean that, well, if your dad has detox issues, then that child definitely has detox issues.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I just flash back to science class when they had like the 4 boxes and like one gene from each parent, and like there's different combinations that can happen. So yeah, that totally makes sense. Yeah. So the genetic piece is one. Previous exposures in your life is the second one. So if you're a kid that grew up in Ohio in a basement that had water damage and mold in it, you're much more likely that your body sort of has like a trauma response now to mold, like it's afraid of it, right? And so now if it sees it, it's literally going to rewire how it responds to an exposure, which means later on in life, you don't necessarily have to be exposed to as much, and your body might freak out, right? Because it's like, oh man, I saw this before and it really impacted me, right? So that's this previous exposures is the second one. And then the third one is just like your current health position, like right now. So your immune system, it's kind of like a funnel. I always use this analogy, right? So everybody, if you could think of a funnel, it's, kind of like a triangle shape down, right? The hole's bigger at the top and then it's tighter at the bottom and the water comes out the bottom. So everyone's funnel is a different size. That's the first thing. So if you think of like the genetic part of it, like if you had the genetic problem, your funnel might be way, way more slanted to the bottom, where the hole at the bottom is teeny, teeny, tiny, right? Because it's hard for you to detox. Whereas if you're somebody who's genetically fine and doesn't have previous exposures, your hole at the bottom of your funnel might be a lot bigger, right? And so we're all working with a different size funnel. And then what happens is anything that you're exposed to, not just mold, but literally anything, heavy metals, pesticides, like just all the stuff that your body is required to get rid of in the world that we live in, gets poured in the top of the funnel. And then it goes down the funnel and it comes out the bottom, and you're talking about methylation pathways and all this. So that's like a very cheap illustration of methylating, right? And so it comes out the bottom.
It's an amazing analogy. I mean, I'm loving the analogies that you're dropping. I'm like a stickler for analogies, and yours are just pure gold.
I appreciate it. So if you imagine that you're pouring water into this thing, and let's say I'm not exposed to a whole lot. And so my water pours, let's say, pretty slowly because my house doesn't have a big mold problem, for example, right? And so the water going in, the mold, the stuff going in the top of my funnel is more slow. If you can regulate the speed of that water pouring into your funnel, it will never overflow if you have control of what you're being exposed to. The problem is a lot of us don't have control over what we're being exposed to. So now if you just poured a gallon of water as fast as you could into the funnel, which is the equivalent of living in a house with a big mold problem, and maybe you have chemicals in the house and you're eating X food with glyphosate and all the stuff, then your funnel overflows. This is like your current health position. So then you add on top of just exposure, but like if you have Lyme disease, well, that really messes up your funnel and what you can be exposed to, right? If you have an autoimmune condition, if you have, fill in the blank, and that's your current health position. So all of these things come into play. And now just imagine you're in a house of 4 people, and I just gave you 3 variables that have like 100 sub-variables under each one. And why am I the only one that's feeling something when my partner isn't? And that's the reason, right?
Makes total sense. All right. I am actually going to have to pause us right here because I have something important to share. Now, as you've probably noticed, we have covered a ton of valuable information with Brian Karr, and honestly, I think we barely scratched the surface. The insights Brian has shared with us are just too good to rush through. So here's what we're going to do. We're splitting this interview into 2 parts. There's so much more gold to uncover, and we want to make sure you don't miss a single bit. Be sure to tune in next week for the remainder of our conversation, where we'll dive even deeper into mold testing and how you can protect your home and family. You definitely won't want to miss it. Listeners, thank you for tuning into this week's episode of The Soaring Child. I'm Dana Kay, your ADHD health practitioner. Keep on thriving. Thank you for listening to the Soaring Child podcast today. To learn more about how to help your child with ADHD soar using natural strategies, visit our website at adhdthriveinstitute.com and follow us on social media at ADHD Thrive Institute.